Hey there people, today I thought I'd take a good look at the physical render engine for you, hopefully showing you some ways you can get better quality and improve your render speeds with any luck. Now you'll find these render engines, if you open up your render settings in general, take a look on the top left corner and you'll find there is the standard and the physical render engine. Now, if you've never really taken a look at the physical engine, I would suggest you do have a good look. It's possible you might have had a quick look, hit render, realised it takes 10 times as long and thought, oh, why would I bother with that? Let me just show you why you'd want to use the engine first. Two broad things. Number one, it potentially allows you to get a better quality image. And the second thing is it can, in a reasonably good number of circumstances, it can render a lot faster as well. Now, as for the image quality, it is broadly down to two things. You can render realistic depth of field and realistic motion blur into your images. Now, sure, you can do these things afterwards in Photoshop and After Effects and elsewhere, but these will actually render it into the image. So whilst you will have some limitations with overlapping objects in Photoshop, you won't have these issues with the built-in ray traced depth of field and motion blur. So I'm not going to dive too much into those because depth of field makes things go blurry, motion blur makes things all smeary. You just turn them on and you're pretty much good to go. What I want to get into though is this stuff down here. These are your subdivisions, your samples. How much quality does it put into each part of the object? Now, first of all, why would you use the physical engine to make it faster? Because if you've had a go with it before, you may have realised it's a lot slower. Now the answer is it can be faster and it can be slower. If you're using a fairly simple scene, if you're just doing a logo with some lights and shadows, truth be told, the standard render engine is probably going to be faster for you. Where the physical engine comes into its own, where it actually gets faster, is on complicated scenes. If you're using high anti-aliasing settings, if you're using ambient occlusion and global illumination and blurred materials and area shadows, for example, if you're going to be using a lot of these features which are quite slow, those scenes will very, very often render an awful lot faster with the physical engine. The reason for this is that with a standard engine, all of these effects, the ambient occlusion, we've got all these accuracy and sample settings, light sources. If I select this light and come down to the shadow settings, you've got to choose how accurate it is, how many samples it uses, and you'll find the same thing for global illumination, for motion blur, for anti-aliasing, for blurred reflections. So, I've got to choose the samples and accuracy down there. So just for one reason alone, if you've got all these areas, the physical engine actually disables all of these settings and merges them all into one setting for you. So if you've got a dozen light sources with area shadows, you don't have to juggle around their quality settings anymore. Just purely with the default settings, if I render this out with a standard engine, this is going to pick out the quality settings from all these different areas and render your image. Now the problem is, let's zoom in here. Grain. Tons and tons and tons of grain. Grain in the shadows, grain in the reflections, grain everywhere. So you'd have to go through all these objects, bumping up their settings one by one to try and improve your image. The physical engine, watch this. If I show you a material, and I just click on a light, all these settings, all these sample settings rather, if I set my render engine to, let's just move this over here. If I set my render engine to physical, bam, gone. They're grayed out. So you could save yourself potentially dozens, if not a good 100 or so settings, which you no longer have to change. Instead, go to your physical settings, they are now all merged into these few numbers here. This is now a nice big overall control for everything in your scene. So that alone is a pretty good reason. Let me show you the numbers. Let me show you what these do, and let me show you which ones you should be setting, which ones you should be changing. First of all, the sampler. This render engine works by sampling your scene. Now, I know all render engines do, but this one does it a lot more granularly. So under your sampler settings, we have fixed, adaptive, and progressive. Now, quickly. Fixed, you should almost never use this. There's rarely an instance where the fixed sampling is going to help you. What happens with fixed sampling is every pixel gets the same amount of detail, and this is just going to be a waste. Big black areas, you're going to waste time rendering them, and highly detailed areas, well, they might not have enough samples. So fixed is rarely a good idea for many things. Maybe for benchmarks and testing here and there, but I wouldn't really use it in any actual image. Progressive is also interesting. It's not very good for final images, much, but it is good for tests, because with the progressive mode, let's render this out. Now my machine will probably make a bit of noise here as the fans spin up. But when I hit render, it continuously renders, it continuously refines the image. So on the first pass, renders it 2 seconds, but then it renders it again, and again, and it will continuously keep rendering over the image with progressively higher and higher settings until it reaches a level which we're happy with. Now this is good while you're working, this is good for tests, but I wouldn't recommend it for a final image because it's extremely inefficient. To get a good quality image for this object actually takes me, with reasonable render quality settings, takes about 25 seconds. Now you can see here we're already up to 35 and it still doesn't look all that good, it's still quite grainy. So it's good for tests because it can give you a result quite quickly, but don't use it for your final images. The only exception I'd really give you for this is if you're going to render things overnight and you just want it to look as best as it possibly can for tomorrow morning. Okay, let me just stop the render before my machine overheats. Okay, in that case, sure, stick it on progressive, hit render, go home for the night, come back in, and it will look good the next day. Just keep in mind though, it will churn through your electricity bill as your machine keeps rendering, probably quite unnecessarily. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with adaptive. Adaptive is the smart choice. Parts of the image which need more detail will get more detail, and parts which don't won't. Okay, now my advice is, as a starting point, there are presets for low, medium and high quality. So sure, you can use these, but you know what? Just go for automatic. If you use automatic mode, it actually makes things easier because all these sample settings here, they get grayed out. We don't need to worry about them anymore. Most things will now be controlled with this threshold here and a couple of numbers down here. Now this number here, this shading error threshold, this is the big one. This is the vital setting. Think of it as grain. This setting is basically asking you, how much grain are you willing to put up with in your image? So if you just want a quick, fast test render, tell Cinema, you know what, I don't care about the grain, just show me what my illumination's going to look like, show me where things are going to go, give me a broad idea. So with 100% grain, hit render, and it takes us 2 seconds. Sure, it looks awful, but I've got a good idea about my lighting here. Now, if you want a quick draft copy, something which you could send to the client, saying, you know, how's this looking? You're probably looking at about 20%. 20% grain. Let's just render over the top of this. So with 100%, it was 2 seconds. If I render this now with 20% grain, it's going to take a little bit longer. But the quality will be okay. It'll be a reasonable quality. So you could send this to the client, say, yeah, you know, how's this looking? Ignore the grain. I'll get rid of that later. But it's taken us 8 seconds. As for a final image, you're looking realistically somewhere between about 3 and 10%. Although it does depend on other settings you have down here, so don't just use this. But for a final image, I would say start at about 10% grain and work your way down. I wouldn't go much lower than about 2 or 3% grain because otherwise you're really going to slow down the rendering, and you could probably optimize it a bit better than that. Now, I should point out, this shading error threshold affects everything. It will determine how your shadows look, your ambient occlusion, your global illumination, your reflections, basically everything, including how detailed textures are on the surfaces of objects. So it's a good broad change, but sometimes you just want to concentrate on one particular part, and that's what these bits down here will do for you. If you've rendered your image, so let's hit render here. So this is 10% grain. This might be a reasonably decent quality. This might start getting close to a final image quality. Okay, that's going to take about 15-20 seconds, but it's looking better. But let's see, our problems here. There's a little bit of grain in the shadows, not the worst thing in the world. The problems really are on this reflective surface here. This is where we're going to have an issue. These reflections on here, not really good enough. So we can either tell the whole image less grain again, maybe 5%, but this will be increasing the quality of rendering on, for example, this material down here, which we probably don't really need. So rather than going even further with this, let's leave it set back at 10. These bits down here will allow you to get a bit more specific. So we can choose how much detail we have on blurred surfaces for materials, for shadows, for ambient occlusion, and so on. So what are these numbers? How should you change them? Should you be using 10, 20, 100, 1,000? Change them one at a time, one digit. Every time these increase by 1, you are telling that setting to use a lot more detail. So the difference between 2 and 3, for example, could completely solve your issue. If you want to get really fine with it, maybe change it in 0.5 increments. It's quite a strong effect. So I'm going to render this out to the picture viewer just so we can test and have a look between them. Okay, let's hit render, this middle render button here. So this is the default settings with 10% grain on it. And this is going to take just under 20 seconds, I think. Let's just pop that down there. And we'll also render it again a second time. This time I'm going to set the blurriness up from 2. I'm going to bump it up to 3. Let's hit render there again. Now, yes, this will take longer, but it won't take as long as if I set the grain down to 5%. So the difference between me setting the grain down to 5% or me doubling up the divisions for the blurriness, it gives about the same render time. However, I will get more quality out of this by specifying it's the blurred surfaces which I want fixing. Because otherwise, if I just change this setting here, a lot of my render time gets wasted. It gets used on things I don't care about, like shadows or global illumination. So let's take a look here now. Okay, so we're looking at about 18 seconds versus 24. And if I just zoom this in, it's this fairly coarse grain compared to this quite a lot smoother grain. So I've just flicked between these again. That improvement's certainly worth it. But in this particular case, I do notice, hey, my shadows also look quite grainy. So this is one of those situations where, you know what, probably the whole image could really do with a bit of a boost, bit of a kick. So I'm going to drop this down to 5%. Notice that when I do change this, these numbers here will automatically change for me. You do need the latest version of 14 or above for this to work. Otherwise, these numbers here just stay static. It does actually change the number behind the scenes. It just doesn't show it to you. But anyway, with 5% grain, so that's going to be a nice, good, final quality image. What I've done with the blurriness, I'm also going to do the same thing with the shadows. So both can go up to 3. And hopefully, when I hit render here, this should give me... Let's zoom out 20%. This should give me a pretty good quality. Now, yes, it will take longer, but it's usually better to build up from having a low quality and increase it until it's good enough and then stop, rather than just cranking up the quality settings and hitting render and thinking, yeah, that looks good enough. But you know what? You might have wasted half your render time. Half of that render time might have been totally unnecessary. And yeah, there we go. There's a little bit of grain left. So that'll just be a little bit of tweaking. Maybe I'd nudge up my blurriness setting. Maybe one more notch. But I'm happy with the shadows. I'm happy with the material shading. I'm happy with the ambient occlusion. And if I do need to increase this quality any further, I know I can specify it in towards just the blurriness. So yeah, hopefully that will do us. So just a quick recap. Do go for the adaptive mode. Do go for automatic samples, so you don't have to sit there saying, well, sample divisions, shading divisions, min, max. Just leave it on automatic. The numbers it uses are pretty sensible. And just use this. This is your main number, and these ones down here allow you to give a little boost to certain areas if you know the problem is in a specific part of the image. Okay, so yeah, do give the physical engine a go. Don't be put off if it was a bit slow during your first tests. It is better for complicated scenes. Have fun. Go make some nice images. Go watch some more videos too.